Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Welcome to our Friday series where we are going over popular Bible verses that are often misapplied and misquoted. I hope that these videos will help you understand these passages properly so that you will know how to apply it to your lives. As the saying goes, a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. In other words, if we fail to understand the context of a particular passage, then we will end up misapplying it to our lives. Today we will be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. This verse is often quoted to say that money is the root of all evil. Some people even reference this verse to say that if Christians are rich, then they are on a path towards destruction. But is this what this verse means? Let's jump in and find out. This verse appears in a letter that Paul wrote to his spiritual son, Timothy. Timothy is a pastor at a church in Ephesus where he is dealing with false teachers. Paul focuses on this topic by talking about false teacher 3 times in this letter. In the closing chapter of this letter, when Paul talks about false teachers for the 3rd time, he specifically focuses on them regarding the topic of money. Paul begins by talking about how the false teachers are saying things that go against what Jesus taught. Paul says that they do not give sound teaching. The word sound is a medical term used to describe a healthy person. So Paul gets right to the issue of false teachers. If a person believes what they taught, then he or she would not be spiritually healthy. Then Paul describes the character of these false teachers. He is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction among people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. First, notice that Paul says that false teachers are conceited and understand nothing. In other words, they are conceited ignoramus. And isn't that the worst combination? It's one thing if a person is conceited because he or she knows a lot, but it's so much worse when a person is conceited when he or she doesn't even know what they're talking about. The way people can know that false teachers don't know anything about what Jesus taught is to see their desire for debates. They aren't looking to help people, but to show off their knowledge by causing fruitless debates and controversy. I'm sure they undermine everything that Paul taught to make Christians question whether it was true. Therefore, Paul says that these false teachers create envy, dissension, slander, and evil suspicions. So what is motivating these false teachers to be this way? Well, look at the last phrase in verse 5. Imagining that godliness is a means of gain. They see Christianity as a way to profit. Paul elsewhere warns against money being a controlling factor in a pastor's life, which is why he did not minister for the purpose of money. You see, Paul is saying that these false teachers were trying to use Christians to get rich. Now, to be clear, Paul had no problem with pastors being paid for preaching the gospel, which is why earlier in the same letter, Paul talks about how pastors deserve their wages. But what Paul is against are those who use Christianity to satisfy their materialistic desires. In contrast to these false teachers' motivation, Paul then presents the proper motivations that Christians should have. But godliness with contentment is great gain. Notice that Paul repeats the same word from the end of verse 5, gain. While false teachers use godliness as a means to gain or profit, Paul says godliness will only be profitable to you if it is paired with contentment. In other words, true godliness only benefits you when you are not using God, but are content in God. The word contentment is a Greek word that Paul borrowed from the Stoics, who were Greek philosophers. The Stoics' favorite virtue was contentment, which meant self-sufficiency. Paul turns the table on the Stoics by saying that true contentment is not self-sufficiency, but Christ's sufficiency. And this is Paul's indictment on the false teachers. Instead of using Christianity for personal gain, Paul says that true followers of Jesus are content with God. So why does Paul say that contentment is the way we should live instead of looking to profit financially? He gives his first reason. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. This is a very practical reason, right? What is the point of accumulating all this wealth if you can't take it with you when you die? As the saying goes, You don't see a U-Haul attached to a hearse. Then Paul gives a second reason. If we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Paul is highlighting the fact that God does not promise prosperity and wealth to every believer. But what he does promise is that he will provide for our needs. And if God happens to give us more than we need, then we should receive it with gratitude and enjoy it without feeling entitled. But what is the danger of chasing wealth? Look at what Paul says next. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Let me point out a couple things here. Paul is not condemning people who are seeking to meet their needs. He is not saying that if you are in poverty, that you shouldn't try to work hard to get out of it. He is talking about people who are greedy for wealth. This desire is dangerous because it will lead people into a snare like a trapped animal. The desire for wealth is like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you'll be. And this desire for wealth will ultimately plunge you into destruction. The word plunge is used to describe people who are drowning. And it is within this context where we come to our verse. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Let me point out a couple things. First, Paul does not say that money is the root of all evils, but the love of money is the root of all evils. Again, he is emphasizing the desire for greed as a problem for the false teachers. Second, Paul does not say that all evils come from the love of money, but that many types of evils come from the love of money. This is repeating what he said in the previous verse, that if you chase wealth, that you will be on a path that will lead to a trap and eventually drown you. So does this verse mean that the money is the root of all evil? Not quite. If God blesses you with riches, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, Paul instructs rich Christians in this very same letter that they should be generous with their wealth towards others. This assumes that God will bless some Christians with wealth. Paul is not saying that it is evil to be rich, but he is saying that a love for money will lead you on a path with all sorts of trouble. Instead, we should be content with God because God is our treasure and he is more valuable than any amount of money. If you want to learn more about this topic, I'll leave a link to a recommended book below in the description box. If you missed the last video about whether Jesus is always in our gatherings, I'll leave a link for you here to watch. Until next time, see you.